The table saw is probably the most useful single piece of woodworking equipment you can own. They do a remarkable number of jobs, but they're also responsible for the greatest number of woodworking injuries. That's either because they're very popular and very common, or because a lot of people use them without fitting the safety guard or without having the safety guard correctly adjusted. The safety guard must always be on behind the saw blade and set it so that the wood can just pass underneath it. And use a safety guard whenever you're ripping, cross-cutting or miter cutting. There are a few cuts later in this video that you'll see where you can't use the guard, for example rebating, but we'll show you the special precautions we take there. Otherwise, as a general rule, always use the safety guard correctly lowered when ripping, cross-cutting and miter cutting. Never trail your fingers behind the work in line with the blade. In fact, always try to keep your fingers out of the line of the blade, so that even if during the cut you hit a pocket in the wood, a dense pocket, or the blade kicks, or you hit a knot or anything, and your hands slip, they're not going to slip into the line of the blade. So always keep your fingers well clear of the line of the blade. Also, never stand directly in line with the blade, because during a cut, either the off cut or the main piece can, under certain circumstances, come flying out towards you, especially if you've got a slightly angled fence. More on that in a moment. But if the offcut were to come flying out, you want it to sail harmlessly past you. So get into the habit of standing near one corner of the machine, still very easy to get to the stop plate to switch off, out of the line of the blade with both your hands and your body. When ripping narrow pieces, always use a captive push stick in combination with the side pressure finger mounted on your protractor to hold the wood against the fence and to push it past the blade without your fingers coming anywhere near the blade. Never reach over or behind a spinning saw blade to remove offcuts from the table. Always have either a flick stick handy or a conventional push stick to push the pieces of wood off the end of the table. Remember, wood grows again, fingers don't. The best method, of course, is to switch off between cuts, wait until the blade stops spinning, and then remove the blocks, any blocks on the table, by hand. The next safety point is often ignored by people to their peril. Never do a freehand cut. What I mean by that is don't ever get a piece of wood, a large sheet for example, with a pencil line down the middle and try to follow that pencil line. It's a guaranteed recipe for trouble, because all you have to do is slightly skew that piece of wood in the cut, and the saw blade can lift up that piece of wood and fling it back towards you at a terrifying speed. So always use the rip fence to guide your work when ripping, and use the protractor to guide your work when cross-cutting or miter cutting. The rip fence must always be set parallel to the blade. The blade is not a point cutter like a router bit, it's a disc. And if you had the fence angled to the blade, then you're going to create a jam-up situation where you're trying to jam the piece of wood between the angled fence and the blade. You'll see later in this video how you cut tapers. You certainly don't cut tapers by angling the fence to the blade. There is one cut you'll see at the very end of the table saw section where you do angle the fence to the blade, but there are special conditions attached to that cut. As a general rule, absolutely parallel, same reading in the front panel window as in the rear panel. Having said that, you can sometimes give yourself 0.5 millimetre to 1 millimetre of escape. For example, if the front fence was set at 150 millimetres, you can have the rear fence, say, at 150.5 or 151 millimetres. That little bit of escape may be necessary to prevent a bit of jamming up between the overhead guard support and the wall of the rip fence. And it's also sometimes useful when you're cutting unseasoned or green material, which tends to move quite a bit. A little bit of escape can sometimes be very helpful there to stop a jamming up situation. If you do find during a rip cut that the wood is tending to bind as it reaches the overhead guard support, then don't try and pull the wood out. What you should do is just hold it there, switch off the power, wait until the blade stops spinning, and then pull the wood out. It's a very bad practice to pull the wood out in the same direction as the blade is travelling. If the wood skews slightly, the saw blade can grab that piece of wood and fling it out towards you at a very high speed. So it's best, if you run into a problem during a cut, hold it, switch off the power, and wait until the blade stops spinning. Always feed your wood into the front of the blade so that the descending saw blade teeth hold the wood firmly against the table and press it down on the table during a cut. If you were foolish enough to try to feed the wood from the back of the blade, you'd be breaking two cardinal rules. Firstly, you wouldn't be using the safety guard. And secondly, you'd be feeding the wood into the ascending teeth. And those teeth would just grab the piece of wood and rip it out of your hands at a terrifying speed. If you're ever confused about which way around your saw blade needs to go, there's a legend printed on the sides of the safety guard which shows you which way around the teeth should be facing. Just make sure your blade's on the saw the right way around. When ripping, it's vital that you keep control of the piece of wood that is between the blade and the rip fence. So either use your fingers if there's room to pass your fingers between the overhead guard and the fence, or use a conventional push stick, or use the captive push stick that comes with your machine to keep control of that piece between the blade and the fence. Because if that piece is left there unrestrained, then the spinning saw blade could dig into the side of that piece of wood and could fling it out towards you again at a terrifying speed. So keep control of that piece between the blade and the fence. You should also consider the offcut. In the case of a simple rip like this, the offcut about 10 millimeters wide will just fall harmlessly aside to the right-hand side of the saw blade. There are other situations, for example, with rebaiting, you'll see that a bit later on, where you have to take other precautions about the offcut, but generally consider the offcut, consider the main piece, and keep control of that piece, the piece between the blade and the fence. Never switch the power onto your saw with a piece of wood touching the saw blade. It'll create an almighty bang and could damage your saw blade, could damage your table. So always back the wood off before switching on the power. By the same token, keep your table clear. Don't allow offcuts to sit on the table. They could vibrate in towards the blade. And certainly don't leave things like tape measures and squares on the table when you're operating. They could also vibrate in towards the blade and cause an accident. If you observe all of these safety rules all of the time, you'll really enjoy your woodwork in complete safety. It's the people who become complacent and blasé, who become very familiar with their product, that often get into the most trouble in woodworking. So observe the safety rules, take your time, rehearse your cuts, think about them,